For nearly 300 years, there was a way of making money in Britain that required no money at all. You did not invest anything. You did not put up capital. You did not sell a business or take a risk with your savings or work a single additional hour. What you did was prove you were wealthy. You showed that you owned assets above a certain threshold, a house, some land, a portfolio. You were interviewed. You were vouched for. And if you were accepted, you signed a document, shook a hand, and from that day forward, a cheque arrived every year. You did not have to do anything for it. The money simply came. The arrangement was called being a name at Lloyd's of London, and for generations it was one of the quiet privileges of the British upper and professional classes. Landowners did it. Retired officers did it. Doctors, solicitors, farmers with a good acreage, widows with a decent inheritance, members of Parliament did it. It was respectable, it was exclusive, and it was, for decade after decade, essentially free. There was one condition. If the insurance policies your syndicate had written ever cost more than they brought in, you were personally liable for the shortfall. Not up to the value of your investment because you had not made one. Not up to some agreed limit because there was no limit. All of it, everything you owned and everything you would ever own. The phrase used inside the market, with a certain amount of pride, was that a name was liable down to his last cufflink. For most of 3 centuries, that clause was a formality, a piece of antique language that made the whole thing feel serious. Losses happened, and they were absorbed, and the checks kept coming. Then, between roughly 1988 and 1992, Lloyd's of London lost around £8 billion. And the clause turned out to mean exactly what it said. Thousands of people who had never bought an insurance policy in their lives, who could not have described what their syndicates underwrote, who in many cases had never been to Lloyd's, received demands for sums they could not conceivably pay. Houses were sold. Farms that had been in families for generations went. People in their 70s and 80s, who had joined decades earlier on the recommendation of a friend, lost everything they had. Some took their own lives. That is a matter of public record, and we will not dwell on it beyond saying it, because it is part of what this was. This is the story of how the most sophisticated insurance market in the world managed to destroy the people who funded it, and of how much of the damage was bad luck, how much was structural stupidity, and how much was something considerably worse. Because that is the genuinely contested question here, and it went through the British courts for years. Start with what Lloyd's actually is, because most people have it wrong. Lloyd's is not an insurance company. It has never been an insurance company. It does not write policies, and it does not carry risk. It is a market, a place, and a set of rules where insurance is bought and sold, in the same way that a stock exchange is not a company whose shares you buy. It began, as the name suggests, in a coffee house. In the late 17th century, Edward Lloyd ran an establishment near the Thames that became the place where men involved in shipping gathered. Ship owners, merchants, captains. And because the great commercial risk of the age was a ship not coming back, the coffee house became where you went to find somebody willing to carry that risk for a fee. The mechanism was simple, and the language survives. A merchant would write the details of a voyage on a slip of paper. Anyone prepared to take a share of the risk would write his name underneath and the proportion he was accepting. He wrote under, He was an underwriter. That is the whole of it. And 300 years later, the structure was recognizably the same. A broker brings a risk to the floor. An underwriter, sitting at a box, prices it and takes a share. Other underwriters take other shares until the risk is fully covered. What changed over the centuries was scale and what Lloyd's would insure. It went from ships to almost anything: factories, aircraft, oil platforms, satellites, professional negligence, the legs of a dancer, the fingers of a guitarist. Its reputation was built on two things: that it would price risks nobody else would touch, and that it always paid. Both of those were true. Lloyd's paid out on the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, when other insurers looked for reasons not to, and the instruction from one underwriter to pay all claims in full became part of the market's founding mythology. That reputation was the product. It was why business came. But the capital had to come from somewhere, and here is where the story turns. Underwriters at Lloyd's did not, on the whole, risk their own money. They operated syndicates, and the syndicates were backed by the names. So follow the structure carefully, because its shape is the entire problem. A name provided capital, but not in cash. This is the part people find hardest to believe. The name pledged wealth. He demonstrated that he had assets above a required level, deposited a relatively modest sum, and then stood behind the syndicate's obligations with everything else he owned. That meant the capital was, in a sense, being used twice. Your house continued to be your house. Your investments continued to earn whatever they earned. And simultaneously, that same wealth was supporting insurance underwriting and earning you a share of the profit from it. For the market, this was superb. It could access enormous capacity without anybody having to hand over cash. For the name, it looked like money from nothing, and for a very long time it was. Through the post-war decades, Lloyd's was consistently profitable. The annual cheque became something families budgeted around. School fees, a second property, retirement. And crucially, the name did no work and made no decisions. He did not choose the risks. He did not see the policies. Most names could not have named the syndicates they were on without checking. They were advised by a member's agent, who placed them on syndicates run by managing agents, who employed the underwriters who actually made the choices. The name was, in practice, a passive guarantor of decisions taken by strangers, with unlimited exposure to the consequences. Nobody thought about that much because for 30 years the consequences were checks. Now, the growth. Because the numbers matter enormously. Around 1970, Lloyd's had roughly 6,000 names. By the late 1980s, it had well over 30,000. That is a five-fold expansion in under 2 decades, and it changed the composition of the membership completely. The old name was seriously wealthy, the kind of person for whom the underlying liability, if it ever crystallized, would be painful rather than fatal. The new name recruited hard through the 1970s and 80s as Lloyd's chased capacity was often nothing of the sort. The wealth threshold was lowered. Recruitment became active and at times aggressive. Agents held meetings in county hotels. People were introduced by friends, by colleagues, by their golf club. The new intake included a great many people of modest professional means, retired servicemen, doctors, teachers who had inherited a house, farmers whose land was worth a lot on paper and produced very little in cash. And they were being told correctly that Lloyd's had been profitable for decades. They were being told correctly that this was how established families had quietly done well for generations. What was not communicated with anything like the same clarity was that they were signing an unlimited personal guarantee against decisions they would never see in a market whose oldest liabilities were already turning bad. Because they were. That is the thing. The bomb was already ticking when the recruiting was at its most enthusiastic. Now the disaster itself, which had two separate causes that arrived at the same moment. Take them one at a time, because they are usually blurred together and they are quite different in character. The first is what the industry calls long-tail liability. Most insurance is short-tail. A ship sinks, a warehouse burns, a claim is made, it is paid, the year is closed. You know within a reasonable period what a year of underwriting has cost you. But some policies cover harms that take decades to appear. And the great example, the one that came close to destroying Lloyd's, is asbestos. American companies had used asbestos on an enormous scale from the early 20th century onward. Workers who handled it developed lung diseases, and the diseases in question have latency periods that can run to 30 or 40 years. Somebody exposed in 1955 might fall ill in 1985. Those workers sued. American courts, from the 1970s onward, took an expansive view of who was responsible and what the insurance covered, and the general liability policies written for those companies decades earlier had been written by insurers, including many at Lloyd's. The same pattern applied to pollution. Land contaminated over decades, with the cleanup cost falling on policies written when nobody had any idea such a bill existed. Now understand what that meant for a name in 1988. The losses being crystallized were not from anything happening now. They were the consequence of policies underwritten in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, before most of the newer names had joined, in some cases before they were born. And Lloyd's accounted on a 3-year basis, with syndicates that reinsured 1 year's remaining liabilities into the next. Which meant those old liabilities did not stay with the people who had backed them. They were passed forward year after year, syndicate after syndicate, and landed on whoever was standing there when the music stopped. The second cause was more straightforward, and it was simply catastrophe. The late 1980s produced an extraordinary run of very large losses in a short space of time, and it is worth naming them because the concentration is genuinely remarkable. In October 1987, a storm crossed southern England that nobody had forecast. Winds well beyond anything in living memory for that part of the country brought down something in the order of 15 million trees, took roofs off, closed the stock exchange, and killed 18 people. It was, in insurance terms, one of the most expensive events in British history to that point. In July 1988, the Piper Alpha platform in the North Sea caught fire and was destroyed. 167 men died. It remains the deadliest offshore oil disaster ever, and it produced an insured loss that ran into the billions, a single object in the middle of the sea worth more than most companies. In 1989 came the Exxon Valdez, running aground in Alaska and spilling crude oil across a coastline in a way that generated liability claims for years. In the same year, Hurricane Hugo crossed the Caribbean and the Carolinas, and an earthquake struck San Francisco during a televised baseball game. Then European windstorms through the winter of 1989 and into 1990, in a sequence, each expensive. Any insurance market can absorb a bad year. That is what an insurance market is for, and Lloyd's had absorbed plenty. What it got instead was 5 or 6 years in which the very large events simply did not stop, and they arrived on top of the asbestos and pollution reckoning, which was building at the same time for entirely unrelated reasons. Neither of those two things caused the other. That is the cruel part. A market can survive an unprecedented run of catastrophes, and it can survive a slow reckoning with old liabilities. Having both at once in the same 5 years is what turned a difficult period into a terminal one for a great many people. And then there is the third thing, which is not really a cause at all. It is an amplifier, and it is the part that turns a bad situation into a catastrophic one. It was called the LMX spiral. LMX stands for London Market Excess of Loss. It is reinsurance, insurance bought by insurers to protect themselves against losses above a certain level. That is a perfectly sensible product. A syndicate that has written a lot of North Sea oil risk buys cover so that a single enormous event does not wipe it out. The risk is passed to somebody with a broader base who can absorb it. The problem is who it was passed to, because the syndicates at Lloyd's were largely buying that reinsurance from each other. Syndicate A reinsures with Syndicate B, Syndicate B protecting itself, reinsures with Syndicate C. Syndicate C reinsures with D, and D with E. And somewhere down the chain, one of them reinsures with A. The risk had gone in a circle. Now a very large loss occurs. Piper Alpha, say. The original claim is paid, and then it enters the spiral, and each time it passes through a layer it triggers another reinsurance claim, and each of those triggers another. The same underlying loss goes round and round the market, generating claim after claim, and at every rotation it picks up further costs. A single event could be paid for many times over, and the individual underwriters could not see it. That is the crucial point, and it is what makes this a structural failure rather than simple greed. Each underwriter was looking at his own book. He could see what he had written and what he had reinsured. He could not see the whole chain because nobody could. There was no central map of who had reinsured whom. An underwriter could, and in some cases demonstrably did, end up reinsuring his own risk without knowing it. He had bought protection from himself. Piper Alpha is the classic illustration. The original insured loss was very large but finite. By the time it had traveled through the spiral, the total claims paid across the market were a substantial multiple of it. So, put the three together and you have the mechanism. Ancient liabilities, quietly compounding for 40 years, passed forward onto people who had not written them. A cluster of genuine catastrophes. And a reinsurance structure that took every loss and multiplied it, invisibly, before it landed. The bills went out to the names, and it is worth describing what that actually looked like, because the mechanics of it are part of the cruelty. Lloyd's accounted on a 3-year cycle. A year of underwriting was left open for 3 years to let claims come in, and only then closed, and the result declared. So a name did not find out how 1988 had gone until 1991, which means the demands arrived long after the decisions that caused them. From syndicates the name might no longer be on, for events they might dimly remember from the news. And a syndicate whose liabilities could not be quantified at all did not close. It stayed open, an open year, indefinitely, with the names on it locked in, unable to leave, unable to know what they owed, and watching the figure grow with each fresh estimate. There was no way out. You could not sell your position. There was nobody to sell it to. You could not resign your way clear, because resigning did not extinguish liabilities you had already backed. Names who had left the market years earlier discovered they were still exposed. So the experience for thousands of people was this: a letter arrives stating a sum. You cannot pay it. You did not choose the risk that generated it. And there is no action available to you that makes it stop, because next year there will be another letter and it will be larger. Several of the named syndicates became notorious, and the litigation around them is what eventually established the facts. The Outhwaite syndicate had taken on old asbestos-exposed business through reinsurance, and its names sued on the basis that no competent underwriter would have accepted it. That action settled in 1992 for a very substantial sum. Gooder Walker was the spiral case. Its syndicates had written excess of loss reinsurance heavily, and when the catastrophes came, the losses ran round the circle and landed back on them repeatedly. The names sued and, in 1994, won. The court found the underwriting negligent, that the exposure had been accumulated without any adequate understanding of it, and the damages awarded ran into hundreds of millions of pounds. Feltrim and Merritt produced comparable findings. Those judgments matter for the argument, because they are the closest thing to an authoritative verdict on what went wrong. And what they found, repeatedly, was not wickedness. It was competent-seeming professionals writing business whose accumulated exposure they had not measured, could not see, and did not attempt to model. And here we arrive at the part that is genuinely disputed, and where this video is going to be careful, because there are two accounts, and the truth is not entirely on one side. The names case was that this was not misfortune. It was fraud, or something close to it. Their allegation had a specific and serious shape. It was said that people inside the market understood by the late 1970s and early 1980s that the asbestos and pollution liabilities were going to be ruinous, and that rather than absorbing those losses themselves, insiders recruited thousands of new names, outsiders with no way of knowing, and placed them disproportionately on the syndicates carrying the worst of it. Recruit to dilute. Bring in fresh capital, not because it is needed for new business, but so there are more shoulders under an old and growing weight. And, the allegation continued, insiders and their families were quietly moved onto the cleaner syndicates. Now, the counter account, and it deserves a fair hearing because it is not merely a defense. Nobody in 1980 knew what asbestos would eventually cost. The figures grew for years, driven by American court decisions that were not predictable from London. Reserving for a liability of unknown size is genuinely difficult, and underwriters who got it wrong were often wrong in good faith. Lloyd's had been profitable for decades, The expectation that it would continue was reasonable rather than fraudulent. And the catastrophes of 1987 to 1990 were, straightforwardly, bad luck. So, what did the courts actually find? Because this is where the honest answer lives, and it satisfies nobody completely. Names brought a great many actions. Several major cases succeeded on the grounds of negligence. Courts found that certain managing agents had failed to exercise reasonable skill and care, that the underwriting had fallen below the standard the names were entitled to expect, particularly around the reinsurance spiral, where syndicates had written excess of loss business without any adequate grasp of the exposure they were accumulating. That is a serious finding, and it produced substantial damages. But it is negligence, not conspiracy. The broader allegation, a deliberate, coordinated scheme to lure in outsiders as sacrificial capital, was not established as a general proposition, whatever individual instances may have looked like. So the fair summary is this. It was not a conspiracy in the sense the angriest names believed. It was worse in a different way, a market where the people making the decisions carried almost none of the consequences, where the people carrying the consequences saw none of the decisions, and where the connecting structure was so opaque that even the professionals could not see what they had built. Nobody had to plan that. It simply worked out that way, and the incentives ensured nobody looked too hard. There is one more structural fact that belongs here, and it explains why nobody outside caught it either. Lloyd's regulated itself. Under legislation passed in 1982, Lloyd's was given statutory authority over its own affairs, with its own counsel, its own rules, and its own disciplinary machinery. And when Britain built its modern financial regulatory system later that decade, Lloyd's sat outside it. The body supervising the rest of the city did not supervise Lloyd's. The reasoning at the time was not absurd. This was a specialist market, 3 centuries old, whose participants were by definition wealthy and by assumption sophisticated. It was a private arrangement between consenting professionals, and outside regulators would not understand it. The 1982 Act also gave Lloyd's a significant degree of immunity from being sued in respect of how it carried out those regulatory functions, a provision names later attacked without success. So consider the position of a retired schoolteacher in 1986, signing an unlimited personal guarantee. The market she was joining wrote its own rules, judged its own conduct, disciplined its own members, and enjoyed protection from legal challenge over how it did so. No outside authority was checking whether the reserves were adequate or the reinsurance made sense. The people best placed to notice that the spiral was accumulating were the people who would have had to admit it. That is not a criticism unique to Lloyd's. It is what self-regulation is, and it works precisely as long as nothing goes badly wrong. By the early 1990s, Lloyd's was facing something close to extinction. Names were refusing to pay. Litigation was consuming the market. New capital would not come near it, and without capital, an insurance market is nothing. The rescue was called Reconstruction and Renewal, and it was completed in 1996. Its central device was an entity called Equitas. Essentially, every liability from 1992 and earlier, all the asbestos, all the pollution, all the spiral, was transferred into a single separate reinsurance vehicle, funded by a levy on the market and by contributions extracted from names. The point was to draw a line. Everything toxic went behind it. Lloyd's, on the other side, could function again. Names were offered a settlement, a debt calculated for each of them, substantially reduced from the raw figure in exchange for abandoning their litigation. Most accepted, because most had no realistic alternative. Some fought on for years. And at the same time, the fundamental change. From 1994, Lloyd's admitted corporate capital. Companies could back syndicates with limited liability, like everybody else in the modern financial world. That was the end of the old model, and everyone understood it. Once limited liability corporate money was available, the unlimited liability individual was obsolete. Their numbers fell away over the following years. A market that had run on the personal fortunes of private individuals for 300 years stopped doing so within about a decade. Lloyd's survived. It is a large and functioning market today, backed overwhelmingly by corporate capital. The names largely did not survive in the relevant sense. Some were ruined outright. Many more sold assets they had expected to keep or pass on, and lived out their retirements considerably poorer than they had planned. Some received damages after years of litigation, some received nothing at all. And they did not go quietly, which is worth recording, because the organized response is the reason any of this is documented at all. The names formed associations, action groups built around particular syndicates, and broader bodies representing thousands of members. They raised funds for litigation from people who by definition had very little left. They held meetings in hotels and village halls. They lobbied members of parliament, a good number of whom were names themselves and had their own demands sitting at home. They were, in the main, not natural protesters. They were retired officers, country solicitors, farmers, widows, people whose instinct was to trust institutions and settle things privately, and who discovered late in life that they would have to fight in public or lose everything. Many refused the settlement offer on principle and continued for years. A number were pursued through the courts by Lloyd's for the money and lost their homes at the end of it. Cases were still grinding through the system well into the following decade. It is a strange sort of collective action. Thousands of individually well-off, mutually unconnected people, most of whom had never met, discovering simultaneously that a document they had signed on a friend's recommendation had quietly attached itself to everything they owned. So, what should we take from it? 3 things, and the first is the one that generalizes furthest. Unlimited liability is not a stronger version of ordinary risk. It is a different thing entirely, and the human mind is not equipped to price it. When you invest £10,000, you can imagine losing £10,000. The worst case is concrete, and you can decide whether you can bear it. Unlimited liability has no worst case. There is no number to hold in your head. And what people do with a risk they cannot picture is quietly substitute the risk they can, which is the historical average, the thing that has happened before, the cheque that came last year. For 30 years, the average was excellent, so the names priced an unlimited downside as though it were a reliable annuity. That is not stupidity. It is what happens when the tale is genuinely unimaginable. You stop imagining it. And notice that the reassurance ran the wrong way round. The longer the arrangement paid out without incident, the safer it appeared, And the more people joined, and the larger the eventual exposure became. A long record of calm is evidence about the past. It is treated universally as evidence about the future. But in a structure with an unlimited tail, an uninterrupted run of good years is not proof that the risk is small. It is only proof that the tail has not arrived yet, and it may well mean the accumulated exposure underneath has grown quietly the entire time, which is precisely what had happened. Every profitable year at Lloyd's made the market more attractive, brought in more names, and increased the amount of asbestos liability sitting undisturbed beneath the whole thing. The good years were not the opposite of the disaster. They were part of its construction. The second is about the separation of decision from consequence. Every serious financial disaster has this feature somewhere, and Lloyd's had it in an unusually pure form. The underwriter chose the risks and took a share of the profit. The managing agent ran the syndicate and earned fees. The member's agent recruited and earned commission. And the name, who bore 100% of the downside, chose nothing, saw nothing, and knew nothing. You do not need anybody in that chain to be dishonest for it to end badly. Everyone can behave reasonably by their own lights, and the structure will still concentrate all the pain in one place and all the discretion in another. Once that gap exists, it is only a question of which decade produces the loss that reveals it. And the third is about time. The single most important fact in this story is that most of the money was lost on policies written before most of the losers had joined. Asbestos claims from the 1950s destroyed people who signed up in 1985. The liability had been traveling forward through the market for decades, through the mechanism of reinsuring each year into the next, gathering weight and never being confronted, because confronting it would have meant somebody at some point taking the hit. So it was passed on, and passed on. And it landed eventually on the people with the least idea it existed, and the least ability to withstand it. That is a much more common pattern than the specifics suggest. A cost that nobody wants to recognize does not disappear. It moves, and it usually moves toward whoever is least able to see it coming. It is worth asking why it moves in that direction rather than any other, because the answer is not conspiracy. A liability travels along the path of least resistance, and resistance means somebody who understands what is being handed to them and is able to refuse it. Every party in the chain who could see clearly declined, quite reasonably, to be the one who absorbed it. So it kept going, and it necessarily came to rest with whoever could see least. There is no wicked decision anywhere in that sequence. There is only a series of entirely rational refusals, ending at the one person not equipped to refuse. The names were told they were joining the most exclusive club in British finance, and in a sense they were. It had a coffeehouse crest, 300 years of history, and a reputation for always paying. It was that last part that ruined them. Lloyd's did always pay. They just had not understood that they were the ones paying. Sources and method. This account draws on the reports of the inquiries into the Lloyd's losses, the published judgments in the principal names litigation of the 1990s concerning managing agents' duties, the terms of the Reconstruction and renewal settlement and the establishment of Equitas, and contemporaneous financial reporting from the period. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all the allegation that new names were deliberately recruited to absorb known asbestos liabilities, This video sets out both the allegation and the findings actually made by the courts, which established negligence in significant cases but not a general scheme. Loss figures for the period are stated as approximations because the accounting basis used at the time makes precise attribution by year difficult.